We ought to want to make more pie. We ought to want to increase and improve everybody's state of life. So, here's Frame speaking on the issue, okay? Now, first of all, he's going to talk about economic considerations in terms of government welfare or support. And first, he brings up this idea that, look, government welfare often tends to reward people for not improving themselves, growing, developing, etc., how it's implemented now. But that doesn't mean wholesale that we should get rid of it. Listen to what Frame says. I think he's pretty balanced here. Frame says, in general, I think that capitalism is the best system of economic organization for both rich and poor. But capitalism does not guarantee all will succeed. People fall through the cracks. Some cannot make it on their own, and churches often turn a blind eye. For such, often the poorest of the poor, there is a place for government support. But that support should be light-handed. It should, when possible, prepare recipients and their children to earn their own living. It should encourage them to find work when they are able. It should turn their care over to families and religious bodies when possible. It should not seek to monopolize or dominate the nation's caregiving system or place barriers in the way of others who have resources to help. Okay? So he says, look, he's not opposed to government intervention across the board, right? Sometimes it may be needed, but it should be light-handed and it should be implemented in such a way that it encourages them to be able to earn a living for themselves and to work where they can. Okay? So we want to develop people's skills and abilities. Give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for his life. That is what we want to be doing when it comes to helping out the poor. We want to be giving them skill sets and trades, abilities for them to contribute to society in a positive manner and earn a living for themselves. And too often, the way the government applies things now doesn't help everyone out, encourage them, promote them in their growth. Instead, it simply works as a handout that discourages participating in the economy at large. And so that's one thing that Frame talks about here. He says, I generally lean towards capitalism, but I'm not saying that there can't be government welfare of any sort. He says it should be light-handed, however, and it should help prepare them to enter into the workforce. This is when he begins to get into the idea, okay? And so we're going to read through everything that Frame has to say on this, and I'm going to stop to make comments as we go. To enlarge on these remarks about government welfare, I will say a bit more about socialism and capitalism as systems of economic organization. Since the Eighth Commandment presupposes private ownership of property, it rejects systems of economics that deny that principle. Okay, thou shalt not steal presupposes that my neighbor has property that I can steal from him. Frame argues that that implies private ownership of property, thus ruling out Marxism. He says Marxism in particular argues that property belongs to the nation as a whole, represented by the state. Therefore, on that view, the state has the right to control all means of production, all products, and all wealth. In other words, the state should control the whole economy. In effect, then, for Marxism, the state replaces God as the ultimate owner and controller of the world. This view falls under the biblical description of idolatry. He says under Marxism, people no longer have property. Property doesn't even belong to God. It belongs to the state. The state takes God's position or role in that place, and therefore it functions as idolatry. Even if you don't agree with his argument on a whole, I think his general principle applies. The Eighth Commandment presupposes that you have some sort of private property that I can steal from you. Thou shalt not steal what belongs to another man. Therefore, Marxism is ruled out to begin with. But that doesn't rule out socialism necessarily. So let's continue. We have seen in recent years the collapse of the Soviet Union, a huge experience in Marxian communism. China remains totalitarian as of this writing, but its economy has become less and less socialist over the last few decades and more open to individual enterprise. The remaining Marxist strongholds of Cuba and North Korea are impoverished. So the pragmatic argument for Marxism is no longer credible. What Frame is saying at this point is it used to be a pragmatic argument. It used to say, practically speaking, Marxism is going to lead to more economic growth. It's going to lead to an improvement of economies, and more people are going to be better off. Now, before Marxism had been tried, perhaps that was a fair argument. But what Frame is saying here is now that Marxism has been tried and failed, we can't lean entirely on pragmatics anymore. It no longer makes a good case for Marxism. In fact, the pragmatics point more towards capitalism rather than the other way around. Even in places like China that are heavily totalitarian in many ways, their economies continue to tend to lean capitalistic and open to individual enterprise, which is a strong case for the pragmatic value of capitalism. But pragmatics aren't our only concern, so let's continue. Nor is the moral argument. Here's the next argument, that socialism brings people out of poverty. Okay, so what Frame is saying is the pragmatic argument doesn't work. Let's go with the moral argument. Even if it's not practically speaking godly, at least maybe morally, we should be for socialism, right? We should maybe be for Marxism, morally speaking, because capitalism is fundamentally founded on the concept of greed and selfishness. And so, morally speaking, even if it leads to a worse economy, perhaps we should stand for socialism or for Marxism because it is morally more proper. But Frame disagrees. Capitalist economies in the West have been far more efficient at alleviating poverty, though that task is not over by any means. Further, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the rest of the world breathed a sigh of relief, for socialism has an inner drive towards world conquest. Since the economies of nations are interdependent, a state cannot fully control its own economy without controlling the economy of the world. What he's saying is, if one state becomes socialist, it kind of needs everyone else to become socialist as well and play along. If it doesn't, then the way the rest of the world's economies relate to that country are going to be capitalistic, and therefore the state itself, due to importing and exporting, is not going to be able to be 100% or entirely socialist. Another way to say this is that once the state replaces God as the owner and controller of the world, the deity of the state must be expressed universally just like God. So the state becomes omnipresent as well as omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Okay? The main ethical argument for socialism is that it is more compassionate than capitalism. Short-term gains in equality do sometimes result from socialism. So he's saying, look, it's been noted, there are some short-term gains in equality. That has happened. Literacy has increased in Cuba, but Cuba was the most literate nation in Latin America before communism, and it is not clear how much of the advance is due to socialism. Socialist states have decreased the gap between rich and poor, but often more by impoverishing the rich than by enriching the poor. That's an important idea. When it comes to socialism versus capitalism, I think an important idea is how much pie is there available to go around. Socialism tends to think that there is a limited amount of pie, that we only have so much pie to give, and in order for us to enrich the poor, we must impoverish the rich. We have to play Robin Hood, take from the rich, and give to the poor, because there's only 100% pie, okay? I disagree with that notion, and we've talked about this before when we talked about economies. I think that the biblical mandate is for us to go out and make more pie. As Christians, if we can go out into the world and do things more efficiently, more effectively, do things more honoring and glorifying to God, do things in such a way as more people are benefited, I think we can increase the share of pie that is available. Okay, so socialism says there's only 100% pie, there's only ever going to be 100% pie, and we need to distribute that pie as evenly as we can. I think a fundamental tenet of capitalism is that we can make more pie. If technology improves, if some sort of advancement comes along, we are not stuck with 100% pie. We can get 105% pie. We can get 110% pie. And once we get more pie, that's going to benefit everybody. I know this is sometimes pejoratively referred to as trickle-down economics, but ultimately, more pie is better for everyone, okay? More pie is better for everyone. If supporting the poor is a lot cheaper for you than it used to be, you're more likely to support the poor. And again, we can have some government involvement in that. I'm not saying it's across the board, must be only private contributions to support the poor. But ultimately, I think we as Christians want more pie. We as Christians want to advance or advocate for human flourishing across the board. Now, that makes me against certain hindrances on economies. We were reading the other day when they had come out with the printing press. Oh, no, it wasn't the printing press. It was weaving. Remember we were reading when people had come up with block weavers so that they could weave fabrics more quickly? And what did the king do? The king put in an order that you no longer could transport these block weavers because they were going to ruin his economy. I think that is ungodly behavior. I think that we ought to actually encourage and promote the technological developments so that we can make more pie for people. If there's more cloth or linen or whatever to go around, then the price falls and now more people can afford clothes, right? That's just the nature of the beast. And so I think we should encourage and promote technological development because that increases the pie that we have and makes things cheaper for everyone, poor included. Okay. And so I tend to lean that direction. If your socialistic tendencies is just take from the rich and give to the poor, I think that you're falling into the wrong area. Let me ask you a hypothetical, and I think it will help you indicate in yourself where you fall on this issue. If I told you this, guys, we have a magic technology that will make all of the poor people 50% richer, but it has the side effect that it is going to make all of the rich people 1,000% richer. Do you think that's a good technology or not? Do you think we should implement that or not? I think this will help you to decide your heart on this issue. I have a technology that can make all of the poor 50% richer, but it makes all of the rich 1,000% richer. Would you say, yes, absolutely, we should go for that technology? Or would you say, no, we ought not to go for that technology? There's such a disparity between the classes. What do you guys think? I'm curious to know what you guys think if such a technology could exist. MLG says yes. Ogre says yes. I think if you have some fundamental reticence for such a technology, I think you are driven more by covetousness than you are by care for the poor. I think you hate that the rich are rich, not that the poor are poor. And that is covetousness. That is not some godly version of I love the poor. No, you don't like that the rich are rich. That's the problem. Okay? I think that's a no-brainer technology. We ought to implement it. We ought to go for it. Serum says, I think that could be a good idea. Very nice. MLG says, because making the poor better off is good no matter how rich the rich get. I agree, MLG. And if your tendency is to say, no, I don't like that technology, you have a covetousness issue. You do not care for the poor, okay? Because if this technology improves the poor's state, you should be for it, irrespective of what happens to the rich. So I think that should be what we're for as Christians. We ought to want to make more pie. We ought to want to increase and improve everybody's state of life, okay? Not just drag down the rich because they happen to be rich. And that's what Frame is getting at here. Selfishness abounds in socialist states as much as in capitalist. The main difference is that in socialism, the way to accumulate benefits is political rather than entrepreneurial. Do you hear that? Everyone is selfish, okay? Socialists are selfish and capitalists are selfish. The difference isn't whether or not there are selfish people. The difference is what are your means of getting ahead. In a socialistic economy, benefits are accumulated politically rather than entrepreneurially. Whereas in a capitalist economy, benefits are accumulated entrepreneurially, okay? By supporting the policies of the governing party. There is no reason to suppose that politicians are any less selfish than entrepreneurs. Do you hear that? The question is, which ones are you giving the power? Politicians or entrepreneurs, okay? Everybody's still selfish. The human heart doesn't change because you implement a governmental system. It just changes who has that power. It just changes who has that authority. Coolblay says, I think some should have concern that would be more about justice rather than covetousness potentially. But in the scenario, I don't know if justice is involved. Right, I just gave a whitewash scenario, but I do see what you're saying. There might be more considerations there, Cool Blaze. I hear what you're saying. Serum says, I'm not anti-rich, but I do feel as like if you made it in life and you're rich, then it should be your moral obligation to help those who aren't as lucky and fortunate. And I agree 100% with that, and we should leave that judgment to God. We should leave that justice in God's hands. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. It is not for us to take that authority upon ourselves, determining, no, we're going to make you pay in this life. If you lavish up riches, have no care for the poor, and do your own thing, God will repay. And we have lost a fundamental Christian attitude that says this is in God's hands. He's going to make all things right. And we need to bring that to the table, regardless of if we're for capitalism and socialism. I think oftentimes These socialistic tendencies have leaned in an atheistic or agnostic direction, and what has happened as a result is they forget that judgment is in God's hands, and so they want to take judgment for themselves. How often do you hear this right now in our day and age? This isn't right. This isn't just. We need to fight for justice. Yes, we need to fight for justice, but ultimately realizing that true justice is in the hands of God, and He is going to make all things right. Ogre says, you can't force charity. I agree. We want genuine love or charity from the heart, not demanding it from the government. The Christian principle is always change the heart first, and the actions will follow. I have no concern whatsoever as a Christian pastor to just teach goats to act like sheep. My concern instead is to convert the goats into sheep and then teach sheep how to act like sheep. And the Bible follows that exact same standard. Paul always teaches, be who you are in Christ. He never teaches, change your behavior so that you will be like Christ. That's not what he says. He says, you are now in Christ. Stop acting like the old man. Start acting like the new man. If you demand taxes from the rich because you want them to act in a godly manner, you're not getting the action or activity from their heart. You are instead just getting it on paper. We're going to continue with the article. Capitalism is often said to be built on selfishness. Very good point, okay? And there is truth in that statement. But there is also a moral case for capitalism, as developed in recent years by such writers as Michael Novak and George Gilder. A successful entrepreneur is one who discerns a need or want among people and seeks to fill that need. Remember, entrepreneurs are the leaders in capitalism. They're the ones who win big, okay? And how do they act? They are ultimately identifying needs or wants amongst people and seeking to fulfill that need or want. So there is an altruistic spirit that accompanies the selfish desire for profit. They go hand in hand. I want to help with a need or a want, and that goes hand in hand with the selfish desire for profit. One cannot say surely that capitalism is purely altruistic. Of course not. Man's heart has fallen. But neither can one say that it is purely selfish, right? That's an overly simplistic, pejorative straw man to say that capitalism is purely selfish. It's absolutely not. And of course, individual entrepreneurs are usually better able to determine the material needs of fellow citizens than are government economic planners. So whatever the motives of entrepreneurs and companies, a capitalist system is more efficient at supplying needed goods. It's more efficient at making the pie bigger, right? Whatever their motives. Leave their motives to God, okay? And again, all you're doing in a socialist economy is you're shifting the power of that system from the capitalist or from the entrepreneur to the politician. And are the politicians going to be able to discern the needs and be efficient at supplying needed goods? Probably not. You make me think, Serum, that it shouldn't be government mandate that forces people to do good, but instead the social stigma. Imagine if there was a social stigma against people who didn't help the poor. Imagine if there was like a social stigma in our society where it's like, everybody helped the poor, and if you didn't, you were like looked down upon. Imagine if there were a poor beggar on the side of the road, and the standard was that people ran over to that poor beggar to help them, and that if you just walked right by them, everyone would look at you sideways and kind of furrow their brow, and you would be judged. I think social stigma might be a better way of accomplishing exactly what you're talking about, Serum. It forces them to do the right thing, but it's through social stigma rather than through government mandate. Although I don't know. I'm just talking off the top of my head right now, right? The Bible does not directly address the question of how a society should organize its economy. As we have seen, it does affirm private property. We saw that with the 8th commandment. Can't get around that. And the principle that one should meet his own needs and his family through work. That's Paul when he says, if you don't work, you will not eat. When it deals with civil government, it presents it as limited, both by divine sovereignty and by other institutions. The Bible's doctrines of divine sovereignty reject totalitarianism. But among non-totalitarian systems, the Bible leaves various options open to us. Our choice among these should, however, take larger biblical values into consideration. I tend to vote for conservative candidates, he says, because conservatives tend to have more respect for Christianity than do liberals. And I honestly believe that free enterprise is better for the poor, on the whole, than is a government management of human welfare. In the last section, however, I argued that government welfare is not wrong in all situations. We already read that. And in some cases, at least, can be defended. So I do not believe that the government involvement in welfare is wrong per se. And if I believed that a liberal government program would improve the condition of the poor, that would go a long way towards persuading me to vote accordingly. You hear that? We shouldn't just be like, I'm conservative. Capitalism all the way. No, if it can be demonstrated, if there is data to support the idea that a liberal government program improves the condition of the poor, then, hey, we should be open to that. We should want the poor to do well. And we should be open to talking about and discussing it. And are there ways that we can improve their condition? The issue is empirical and pragmatic more than specifically theological. Does a particular political system seem to help the poor? If that program is in accord with generally biblical view on the scope of government, then it may well deserve the support of Christian voters. Boom. That's what we need to ask. That's what we need to ask. Does a particular political program seem to help the poor? If that program is in accord with generally biblical view of the scope of government, then it may well deserve the support of Christian voters. Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here, and I'm so glad you found our content, and we hope you enjoyed. If you would consider hitting like and subscribe, that would be very helpful. But more than that, I would love if you would head down to the comments and you would offer your thoughts on this subject. It's a very important one, and I would love to hear what you have to say. Thanks for being with us. Take care. God bless, and bye now.